What has fundamentally changed about Pokemon games? Discussing the failures of modern Pokemon games might be trite at this point, but I'd like to contribute to the discussion by elaborating on an aspect of the two-dimensional Pokemon games that I really only ever hear mentioned in passing, if at all. And that's that the old Pokemon games were Metroidvanias disguised as RPGs. To phrase this another way, Metroid is the giant whose shoulders Pokemon stands on, and it's what gave those old two-dimensional Pokemon games their sense of wonder and progression. For context, the first Metroid game came out in 1986. Pokemon Red and Blue, in comparison, were released in 1996. So the timeline is consistent with the idea that Pokemon could be inspired by Metroid, as there is about a decade-long gap between the two games. But what makes a Metroidvania a Metroidvania? What traits does that share with Pokemon? And why is straying from that inspiration a problem for the Pokemon series? Let's start out by figuring out what the defining characteristics of a Metroidvania are. First and foremost, you need an interconnected map. In Metroid, that would be Zebes, where the entirety of your gameplay is confined. You might move around the different zones within Zebes, but you will always be in Zebes. And notably, you can always go back to somewhere where you've already explored. The second defining characteristic of a Metroidvania is the means through which you navigate and progress through the single world that you are confined to. As a protagonist, you're actually very impotent when you begin your journey. As you explore, you'll slowly start to find upgrades like more potent weaponry, boots that make you jump higher, a power-up that lets you transform into a tiny ball so you can fit into tighter spaces, laser beams that freeze enemies rather than kill them so that you may use them as platforms, and you can also obtain a new spacesuit that allows you to survive in harsher environments. These upgrades are important in Metroid because of the previously stated fact that you can backtrack through the world at any time. The new power-ups you receive completely recontextualize the environments that you've already explored. In a Metroidvania, sometimes the way forward is to actually go backwards. This means that the player is not only rewarded for platforming or combat prowess, but for their ability to make note of intriguing obstacles they can't currently bypass, but might be able to in the future. So to summarize, in a Metroidvania, you have one single interconnected world to navigate, you need to gather power-ups to be able to fully navigate that world, and you may occasionally need to backtrack with those new power-ups in order to progress. Alright, so I've explained what a Metroidvania is. What does Pokemon have to do with it? Isn't Pokemon supposed to be an RPG? Well, that's the neat thing about video game genres. They don't have to be mutually exclusive to each other. While Metroid lacks the party building that's characteristic of RPGs, it does share the feeling of progressions that make the RPG so satisfying to engage with. Old Pokemon games, likewise, get their satisfying feeling of progression not only through conventional team building, but by sharing similar means of navigating and engaging with its world, or in Pokemon terms, its region. While you can't get cool new spacesuits or high jump boots in Pokemon, you could get something a lot more contentious. HMs, hidden machines. Instead of high jump boots, screw attack, morph ball, or the Varia suit, you instead get cut, surf, rock smash, strength, etc. This is perhaps the most contentious thing I'll say in this essay, but the HMs were an integral part of the two-dimensional Pokemon experience. So why did people dislike HMs initially? Well, it's because they caused a lot of friction. They aren't forgettable until you gain access to a move deleter, and it can be difficult to get a good move to replace it, due to how limited TMs were in the older generations. For Red and Blue in particular, those games didn't even have a move deleter. But, in a sense, HMs are to TMs as key items are to regular items. You need them to progress. And because you need them to progress, they force you to make an important team building decision. Do I spread HMs out over all my Pokemon, giving each of them a potentially bad combat move but a potentially important exploration tool? Do I put as many as possible on one Pokemon so all my other Pokemon can have 4 good moves, but effectively beat down a Pokemon in battle? Or do I put only combat moves on my Pokemon at the risk of not being able to further explore if I happen to find terrain that requires an HM to navigate? This friction-inducing relationship between team building and navigation is where the older Pokemon games marry the RPG and Metroidvania. Your Pokemon aren't just there for battle. The HMs you teach them allow them to help you solve puzzles, explore secrets, and progress forwards. This was very important because it meant your Pokemon were a part of how you navigated and moved through the world. Nothing felt more badass than teaching my Charizard Fly, or teaching my Swampert Surf, and zipping around the water. Even though the Pokemon you surf on were portrayed as dark blue amorphous blobs, it was still fun to imagine I was surfing on my starter Pokemon. That's the power of the RP aspect of the RPG that people seem to forget about. Now let's run with the example of Surf, and take a look at what Surf allows the player to do in Kanto. It's obtained in Fuchsia City in the Safari Zone, and the player has quite a few options for how they can leverage this new ability. If you're completely stuck, you might look at your town map and notice Cinnabar hanging out in the southwest. You might then notice that it connects to water routes from Pallet Town or Fuchsia City. If you're able to figure out how to go south of Fuchsia, you'll be on your merry way to Cinnabar. And you might happen to stop and wonder about the Seafoam Islands that you passed on the way. If you choose to go in the Seafoam Islands, you'll be greeted with a brutal navigational puzzle, complete with boulders, in which case you better hope you picked up strength while in Fuchsia, some surfing, and multiple floors to the cave. You might even get overwhelmed and come out with nothing. You might get lost and have to dig or escape rope out, and you might just decide to leave and then come back with some repels and maybe some more healing potions. Or maybe you forgo the repels and you buy some Pokeballs instead. Maybe you just leave and forget about the place and never come back at all. Or, you might try to stick it out and explore through as much as you possibly can. And if you do, you are rewarded with an Articuno encounter at the end. This is an entirely optional zone you do not need to engage with, but if you do, you're rewarded for it. Of course, this is also assuming you decide to go south of Fuchsia, or that you decide to eventually go east of Cinnabar. The other option to get to Cinnabar is to go south of Pallet Town, and if you do, you're rewarded with a patch of grass filled entirely with Tangela. Tangela isn't even really that good, but the combination of its mysterious design and the fact it has an entire grass patch dedicated to it, hiding right behind your hometown, makes it feel special the first time you find one. And those two routes are just the immediate candidates for where you're likely to go after finding Surf. If you're particularly keen, you might happen to recall the water in Cerulean Town. Surf across that, and you'll be met with a lady guarding a cave entrance who tells you you're not ready to go in yet. If you happen to remember her, You might choose to come back after each gym badge you obtain after meeting this mysterious woman. And if you continue to do this after progressing far enough, the exact conditions, which will depend on what generation you're playing, she'll eventually let you in the cave. Much like the Seafoam Islands, you will be met with a brutal cave gauntlet with high-level Pokemon, and eventually you'll encounter a Mewtwo at the end if you stick it out long enough. When I was a child, I didn't do any of these things after finally getting Surf. I was completely lost and stuck, and I didn't think to check the town map, and I started flying around randomly. Eventually, I found my way over to Route 10, and happened to notice there was a bit of fence posts missing on the northeastern end of the route. And lo and behold, water. I surfed down the water, and hey, a building. I had found the power plant. I made my way through it, and you can imagine how excited I was to see what was at the end of it. A Zapdos, my first legendary encounter. Throwing the Master Ball at it that I had received in Saffron felt like a no-brainer. More to the point, however, you can see how Surf opens up the potential for exploration in a way that resembles a Metroidvania. By flying around looking for patches of water, I was rewarded with a trip to the power plant and an unexpected encounter with a legendary. By wondering what was in the water south of Pallet Town, I would eventually find my first Tangela. And by wondering what was east of Cinnabar, I would eventually stumble into my second legendary. Particularly keen players, or players who happen to be passing through Celadon, may also remember or notice a man there in the center of town who is fenced in behind a swimming pool. You can talk to him as well for a surprise by surfing across the pool. So right out of the box, as soon as the player finds Surf, the player has a multitude of optional and required options for what they can do with their new ability to surf as soon as they receive it, which leads to that Metroidvania feeling of exploration and discovery. Because Pokemon used to rely on Metroidvania elements to provide a sense of exploration, it shouldn't come as a surprise that abandoning those roots therefore makes the games feel like there isn't anything to explore anymore. Although, I think it would be more concise to say that the issue isn't solely in abandoning Metroidvania elements. It's that they didn't add anything meaningful to fill the gameplay void. The issue isn't just that they removed HMs. It's that they removed HMs and the associated overworld puzzles those HMs facilitated solving. The result is the long, hollow corridors people now complain about. This problem is also why the removal of Victory Road is so damaging as well. Whereas the Elite Four served as a battle capstone to test your team building and tactical prowess, the Victory Road served as a capstone to test the player's ability to plan for the hardest gauntlet of endurance and environmental puzzles they'll have had to endure at that point in their gameplay. You do not get the privilege of challenging the Elite Four if you can't even make it to them. It's also worth noting that HMs weren't the only way to explore in the older Pokemon games. There were plenty of other ways the games encouraged exploration, which didn't rely on HMs. Take the Trick House in Hoenn, for example. It was a recurring event that rewarded players for revisiting it. Each time you came back, there was a new puzzle to solve, and you'd get a reward for completing it. The real trick was remembering to visit it. Just like the other features that encouraged revisiting places over the course of your playthrough. Then there were the bikes in Hoenn, the Mach bike and the Acro bike. You could only have one bike at a time, so choosing which bike to use came at the opportunity cost of not being able to use the other one. But you also didn't have to stick with your choice permanently. The bike shop in Mauville let you switch bikes whenever you wanted, giving you the flexibility to tackle different types of terrain depending on what you needed at that time. This is especially true with the Safari Zone in Hoenn, which required you to use both bikes and able to fully explore it. You'd end up making multiple trips to see everything that Safari Zone had to offer. And then there's also the item finder, which encouraged players to explore every corner of the map looking for hidden items. It was a reward for being thorough that, like everything else discussed, encouraged backtracking and exploration. Finally, the fishing rods encouraged you to cast your line at every body of water to see what types of Pokemon you could find. But the real fun was in the discovery. As a kid, and even when I revisit the older Pokemon games as an adult, I'd find myself debating which key item to register. The item finder, the bikes, or the fishing rods. They all offered different ways to interact with the region, and picking which one to keep active was always a tough call. But that's what made the exploration so enjoyable. There was always something new to find, and it never felt like a chore to go back and revisit places I'd already been. Those old 2D Pokemon games were just like those Metroidvania games, where you could comb through old areas with new tools, and you could uncover hidden secrets along the way. In summary, I think what the modern Pokemon games fail to provide is a reason to do things you don't have to do. They are anti-Metroidvania. You don't have to run around item finding. You don't have to swap to the Acro bike from the Mach bike to check out the areas you couldn't initially explore in the Safari Zone. You don't have to surf off the side of Route 110 to discover the Kanto power plant, and you don't have to surf to the man behind the body of water in the middle of Celadon City to see what he has to say. You could entirely avoid all of these detours and secrets, but you have the option to go off the beaten path. Not because you have to, although sometimes you do, but because you want to. After all, how could you not want to see what's hiding behind the flowers you can't initially reach behind the fence on Route 104 in Hoenn? And how could you not want to see what's hiding around the water in Lake Verity in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl? After all, when the game doesn't require you to do something, you feel like you found it all on your own. Even though the reality is that the explicit design of these routes was a conscious choice by the developers to nudge you in those directions. That's the feeling modern Pokemon games are missing. The joy of exploration, the reward of stumbling upon something meaningful that's optional, but enticing. That's what made the older Pokemon games feel special. There was always something waiting for you off the beaten path, which is what the marriage of RPG and Metroidvania provided. And with the aggressive divorce of those two genres, that special feeling of exploration is lost entirely.